Judges Corner is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com, the best online retailer for Magic the Gathering singles and sealed product, and gatheringmagic.com, your place to explore the game. Now it's time for Judges Corner.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Judges Corner. Unfortunately, David's going to be gone for a few weeks, so y'all are stuck with me. My name is Ricardo, and I'm an L1 straight out of Orlando, and today we're going to be going over Battle for Zendikar mechanics. We have a lot to go over today, but these mechanics are pretty simple to learn, so let's go ahead and dive right in. First off, let's look at the returning mechanics, and then we'll get to some new ones. Let's start with Landfall. Landfall is a pretty easy mechanic to learn, but tricky to master. Landfall is a triggered ability that triggers whenever you put a land onto the battlefield. When it triggers, each card with Landfall has a specific ability that gets placed on the stack. Scythe Leopard, for instance, gets +1/+1 when a land enters the battlefield. Now, it's whenever a land enters under your control, so lands that you grab with Natural Collection or Explosive Vegetation will also trigger Landfall. Lands grabbed with the Khans of Tarkir fetch lands also count as well as the fetch lands themselves. This is effectively giving you 2 Landfall triggers. Multiple Landfall triggers that trigger at the same time can be placed on the stack in whichever order the owner of those triggers wants. Next, it's a returning mechanic with a name this time around. Rally is a very simple triggered ability that triggers whenever an ally-type creature enters the battlefield. Any creatures with Rally will then trigger. These triggers can be placed in any order if multiple Rally triggers would be placed on the stack. So say you had a core Blade Whirl, a core Entanglers, and a Gideon ally of Zendikar on the battlefield. If you were to activate Gideon's first ability, you wouldn't get any of the Rally triggers because Rally will only trigger if an ally were to be put in the battlefield, and well, Gideon's already there. However, if you were to activate Gideon's second activated ability, then you will get each Rally trigger when the ally soldier enters the battlefield. Now we will go over the new mechanics. First on the list is Converge. Converge cares about how many different colors of mana you spend on spells. Normally we wouldn't care, right? For instance, if you've ever cast a Crater's Claws, you don't really care about what colors you pushed into the X part of Crater Claws cost, just that you had to pay a red for it. Well, Converge cares, and the reason this mechanic is around is pretty flavorful. Let's take a look at United Front. It costs 1 white mana and 3 colorless. Now how we fill that 3 colorless matters, but we only have that 3 colorless. We are limited by the spell's cost, so if it costs 4, we can only pour 4 mana into it. So we will get at least 1 ally by paying the mandatory white mana, but we could spend blue, red, green and get a total of 4 ally creature tokens out of it. Say we spend blue, red, red though, well, then we're only going to get 3 ally creature tokens. The next mechanic we have is Awaken. Awaken is a cool but complex mechanic, so let me go ahead and explain. It allows us to push some extra mana into a spell to bring one of our lands to life, making it a creature in addition to a land. For example, we will use Scatter to the Winds. For 1 and double blue, we can counter a spell, and if that's all we wanted to do, great. However, if we wanted to add some trouble for our opponent, we could pay 4 and double blue and turn one of our lands into an elemental with 3 +1/+1 counters, along with countering their spell. Another thing to be aware of, if you want to use Awaken, you have to be ready to have all available targets ready. You can't just cast Scatter to the Winds with Awaken if there are no spells readily available to counter. Also, if your spell with Awaken gets countered, Awaken also gets countered. Lastly, let's say you cast a spell with Awaken that normally doesn't have a target, for instance, Planar Outburst. By casting it with Awaken, you're adding a target. This means that if your opponent makes that land an invalid target by either destroying it, returning it to your hand, or doing something that would cause it to be unable to be a valid target for Awaken upon resolution of that spell, the whole thing gets countered. You will not get a creature land, and you will not wrath the board. It sucks, but it asks you as a player, is the risk worth the reward? It will come up as frequently as a blue moon, but you should be completely aware of that. Alright. Moving on to Ingest and Processors. They work in tandem, so it's important to go over them together. Ingest is a triggered ability some Eldrazi's have that work off of dealing combat damage to your opponents. Once you've successfully punched your opponent in the gut, you exile the top card of their library. Processors are Eldrazi that take that fuel and use it to wreak more havoc. For example, Void Attendant is an Eldrazi processor that can take your opponent's exiled cards, and with a little bit of mana, can make a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion. The way they process exiled cards is by putting any card in your opponent's exile zone back into their own graveyard. In multiplayer games, you can choose other opponents, and this isn't limited to what you've ingested with creatures. You can process any exiled card from an opponent's exile zone. Devoid is another new mechanic that is very awesome. Here we will use Barrage Tyrant as an example. Being colorless, he is a 5/3 that can block creatures with protection from red, can be nabbed from your library if you're searching for a colorless card, and can slam things with protection from red with his activated ability. This is great for the red mages that stumble with all the hate. Last thing I'm going to go over, and it ties a pretty bow on Devoid as well, is the Eldrazi Scions. Our once beloved Eldrazi spawns are all grown up. These little guys are 1/1 colorless Eldrazi tokens that can get plopped out by Eldrazi creatures in some instants and sorceries. You can stack these little dudes for 1 colorless mana, and this ability doesn't use a stack, so your opponents can't respond to it, similar to that of tapping a land for mana. The reason I mention this would tie a bow on Devoid is that colorless creatures are not always artifact creatures. Eldrazi's are notorious for being colorless and also being confused for artifacts by newer players, so I figured I would just clear that up here. It's only an artifact creature if it says in its type that it's an artifact creature. Alright everyone, so that's all we have for today. It's pretty simple, right? Well, if you guys have any other questions or comments, go ahead and throw them down in the comments below, and I'll go ahead and I'll answer any questions that you have. If I have any additional time, then I can go ahead and throw in some additional examples, so that way I can clear up any more confusion that you guys have. Now, if I helped any of you at all, please go ahead and like this video so that way I know that I helped you out. And as always, you can find more Judges Corner at Gathering Magic. Thanks for watching.